a distinguished Kenyan environmentalist. And I was also mentored by no person other than one of Africa's most outstanding political scholars, Professor Ali Mazui, who comes from Mombasa in the Republic of Kenya. The poem is titled, Uganda is Paradise. Uganda is a land of the sun. It is a land of the zebras. It is a land of the gorillas. It is a land of the lions. It is the pearl of Africa. At the Maxon Falls, when the waters flow, the lions roar, the giraffes yawn, and the rains fall. Uganda is a nation of many nations with diverse peoples, diverse cultures. They are ruled Kalamajongo, Banyankole, Abakiga. They are also kings, eminent kings, big chiefs, Emorimor, Omukuka, Adora, Ruwot, Obusinga, Kyabazinga of Busoga, Omukama of Toro, Omukama of Bonyoro. Ini Buganda, the Kabaka reigns, he does not rule, but he still commands. There are also birds, the beautiful birds, the red eagles, the flowing birds, the loving birds, the African skimmer, the shoe-bill stork, the fish eagle, the crested crane, the crested crane, the crested crane.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And let me use this opportunity, with the permission of the organizers of this important conference, to donate a special book by John Ken Lukyams on Uganda, a creature of the federal doctrine. The book is regularly available at Alistock Bookshop and the Mukono Bookshop. May I have the honor of presenting this book to you, Professor Lumumba?
Do so. A hand clap for Honorable Chamzi, the man. So, Honorable Mao and other people that have access to the Deputy Speaker, please tell him that there's quality in Parliament as well. Former parliamentarians can write books, poems, present them as well, as you have just seen. Thank you. Let's give Honorable Chamzi another hand clap. So, I'd like to invite Professor Lumumba. Professor Lumumba, Plo Lumumba. In preparation for this talk is when I learned that PLO are names. I've always known you as Professor PLO. So Professor PLO is Patrick Locke Otieno Lumumba. Loch Lumumba. Pardon? Loch is power. Okay, thank you. I should know these things, you know, when we say Oscar for Oscar, O for Omao, so Loch is for power. He's a Kenyan lawyer, former director of Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, and a renowned anti-corruption crusader. He was born in August, 17th August, his birthday. Please send him a happy birthday note every time his birthday comes around. He's still a very young man, so I'll not read the year. He studied law at the University of Nairobi, graduating with a Bachelor of Laws. He later earned his Master's in Law, LLM, at the same institution. Began his career as a lecturer at the University of Nairobi's Faculty of Law. In 2010, he was appointed as the director of the Anti-Corruption Commission, a position he held for a year. He has also worked with the African Union and the United Nations. He's into public life and activism. Professor is a vocal advocate for good governance, transparency, and anti-corruption. He has delivered numerous public lectures and has been a strong critique of corruption in Africa. His speeches and lectures are widely popular and he has become a celebrated figure in the fight against corruption. He has publications, authored several books, including The Faces of Corruption and Constitutional Law, a Contextual Approach. If you'd like to know more about his books, speeches, or work as an anti-corruption crusader, or if there's anything else you'd like to know, first listen today, and then we shall give you the links for you to follow up. Professor Lumumba, I invite you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by acknowledging my very good friend, the Minister for Justice and Constitutional Affairs, the Honorable Norbert Mao, my very good friend, Dr. Sarah Birete, and of course, my very good friend, Miriam Matembe, and General Mugisha Muntu, and all who are here, and in absentia now, the Deputy Speaker. When I was asked to speak this morning, I chose a subject which gives me the liberty to say many things about the subject of constitutionalism in the East African region. My notes will be circulated, so I may appear to be speaking extempore, but my notes are there for reference later in the evening once you are reading. When we talk about constitutionalism, it is always important to remind ourselves that the post-colonial African state is an artificial state. And I urge you to read a book that has been written by Nigeria's Adekeye Adebayo, The Curse of Berlin, Africa After the Cold War. In that book, he says many things, but relevant to my presentation is the recognition that the entities we now know as Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and even South Sudan, comprising the East African community, are creations of an arbitrary process undertaken by the European powers in Berlin. And for that reason, when we talk about these countries and we talk about Africa and we talk about constitutionalism, we must always remind ourselves that, number one, the discourse is foreign, the language is foreign, the philosophy is foreign. And when we use words such as constitutionalism, we must recognize their foreign nature. When we use words such as democracy, we must recognize their foreign nature. When we use words such as the rule of law, we must recognize their foreign nature and their lack of rootedness in what one may characterize as African culture. And therefore, when we grapple with the question of constitutionalism and even talk about constitutions in the context that we mentioned them here, we must not lose sight of that reality. We must remember that this continent was subjected to foreign rule, and the political and therefore legal cultures that we have a foreign rooting. If, for example, you know the history of colonization, you'll recognize that the Italians had their territories in the continent of Africa. Libya, what is now called Somalia, was a territory of Italy, and what they did was to impose a legal culture in these territories. The French had their colonies, and when they were living in the early 1960s, they imposed a constitution that was characterized as the Gaullist constitution after Charles de Gaulle. The Germans were colonizers but lost their territories. They lost Dahomey, now Benin. They lost part of Cameroon. They lost part of Togo. They lost Rwanda, Urundi and they lost, of course, Tanganyika after the First World War. And these countries were then transferred to other European powers. And when they were leaving Rwanda, Urundi, they imposed a constitution that was tailor-made in Belgium. The same with the Democratic Republic of Congo when they were leaving in 1960. In Uganda, when they were leaving in 1962, in Tanzania, 1961, when the British had taken over, in Kenya, 1963. And it is not lost on me that these constitutions that were of a British kind were referred to as Westminster model constitutions. So when we who are lawyers are talking about these constitutions, we must always be alive to those realities and be alive to the fact that the constitutional order that was imposed upon African countries was alien. And that is why we actually suffer with these constitutions. I remind our audience to go to the United States of America and remember the words of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that it is for this reason that governments are instituted amongst men. But when they were making that declaration, they did not mean all men. Women were not included. Africans were not included. And there had to be a civil war and ultimately the Missouri Compromise. And until 1963, the civil rights movement for the black man to vote. That tells you the journeys of constitutions. And that journey is what we call constitutionalism. And I think my good friend Norbert Mao put it so very well, that the pomp and color and the razzmatazz of the wedding is not what follows the marriage, which is attended by trials and tribulations. So it is the life of a nation. So today, when we talk about the constitutions and constitutionalism, we've got to ask ourselves, what are we talking about? When a European scholar is talking about constitutionalism, whether he is of German persuasion or French persuasion, or is of British persuasion or Dutch persuasion or Danish persuasion or Norwegian persuasion or Swedish persuasion, are they referring to the same thing? Look at the history of Europe, for example, from the days of constitutional monarchies, when they had to behead all their kings. And I always remember just before the French Revolution, there was a French king, I think it was King Louis XIV, when he was asked, what is the state? He said, L'État, c'est moi, I am the state. In other words, he had taken the view that he was the embodiment and the personification of the state. And after him, of course, Louis XV and Louis XVI, and ultimately we see the French Revolution. And we see that the history of human rights in Europe is changing in that way. In the United Kingdom, you'll be familiar with the Magna Carta, and you'll be familiar with the habeas corpus laws. And in what became the Soviet Union, you'll be familiar with what happened with the Bolshevik Revolution. All these are indicative of the struggle that constitutions go through. So today, when we are talking about constitutionalism in the continent of Africa, we must wrap our minds around that and ask ourselves, what is the character of the neo-colonial state? And I want you to read Kwame Nkrumah's famous book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And Kwame says in that book, among other things, that your typical post-colonial state was actually designed to fail. It was designed to fail, and the constitutional order that was given to us was something that it was a rope with which we could commit political suicide. And quite a number of countries did indeed commit political suicide. And because my focus is on the East African scene, and we are talking about constitutionalism, let us hazard some kind of definition. When we talk about constitutionalism, what do we mean? We mean a limited government, a government where the organs of the state enjoy operational autonomy, so that the executive has operational autonomy, the legislature has operational autonomy, the judiciary has operational autonomy. But that is also subject to interrogation. In 1967, a Ugandan whom you must know, Picho Ali, wrote in the Ugandan transition at that time when he was asked about the independence of the judiciary. He said, when all is said and done, I am of the view that there is nothing like independence of the judiciary. That the so-called independence of the judiciary is nothing but division of labor. Whether he was right or not is a different debate. But that tells you that African scholars have always interrogated the question of what indeed is constitutionalism. Writing in 1972, Okoth Ogendo of Kenya writes what has remained one of the most iconic writings about constitutions and constitutionalism in Africa. He talks about constitutions without constitutionalism. And that is where I want to peg my intervention, constitutions without constitutionalism. Yash Gai and Patrick McCausland also interrogate this. They say that Africa is a graveyard of beautifully written constitutions, constitutions which are honored only in breach. And let us interrogate what is meant by that by looking at the history of all the countries in East Africa. Let us look at Uganda, for example. Uganda regains our political independence, and it brings together different forms of governance. There are kingdoms, Bunyoro Kitara, the Baganda, and others. And there are others who are governed differently. But suddenly they find themselves in a gridlock through a creation of a colonial device, which is called Uganda. They have a constitution which recognizes those realities. But from day one, the seeds of discord are to be found within that constitution. And no sooner has the new state even started crawling than the Ugandan political elite begin crumbling. And you see that there is a struggle to give meaning to that constitution. And it is in that context that one must see the contestation between the Kabaka at that time and the Apollo Milton Obote administration culminating in the bombardment of Mengo, and ultimately the document that Ugandans know as the Common Man's Charter, the movement to the left, and culminating in the Pigeonhole Constitution, which, as Norbert Mao told me, even those who had read it so very eloquently said, I have not read the Pigeonhole Constitution, but it's a wonderful constitution. But of course, it did not see light of day. And you see, this constitution is now beginning to have challenge. And that is how you begin to see the numerous amendments, because the constitution do not address the reality of politics. In other words, you have a constitutional order which is not relevant to the reality of the moment, and is not unique to Uganda. Ultimately, that constitution is overthrown in 1971. And what do we see? That Uganda goes into a very tumultuous situation, culminating in the numerous administration, and ultimately in 1986, when the NRM administration now says, we must go to the people of Uganda in order to get the pulse of the nation. The Odoki Commission in which you serve must then be seen in that context, that this is a people-centered and people-based constitution, the 1995 constitution. But even when the constitution is people-based and people-centered, you can still see the political elite. When the power dynamics are in the space, the political elite now begin to question that constitution. And you've had your constitution going through different amendments. And it's important to say something about a country like Uganda and the NRM. The NRM is in the nature of a liberation movement. And liberation movements have a difficulty throughout Africa in transiting into political parties. The liberators normally have a sense of entitlement. Most liberators suffer from what I call the Jehovah complex. The Jehovah complex is to mean that they are the personification of what is good and right, and they cannot be questioned. It is not unique to Uganda. You see it in SPLA, SPLM. You see it in African National Congress. You see it in Frelimo. You see it in MPLA. You see it in ANC. And you see it in the original political parties in KANU and BDP in Botswana. So Uganda goes through that phase. Kenya, which is also a British colony, goes through a phase that is very similar. We regain independence on the basis of Act number 1968 of 1963. But Kenya is very unique in that regard, that there are two major political parties, the Kenya African National Union and the Kenya African Democratic Union, which is sympathetic to the erstwhile colonizer, and they have two different philosophies. KANU, on the one hand, takes the view that because of the ethnic complexion of Kenya, you need a unitary type of government, while KADU says that because of that very reason, you need a federation. So one problem, two prescriptions. Ultimately, what happens, we end up with the 1963 constitution, and no sooner has the constitution settled than we begin to amend the constitution. We abolish the Senate, we abolish the federal units, and KADU is persuaded to join KANU, and the constitution is amended, ultimately leading to its being reorganized and reissued in 1969, and it goes through a series of 37 amendments until in the year 2001, we go through a constitution-making exercise, and we don't succeed. The referendum fails. We ultimately have a near civil war in 2007, 2008, and we have a constitution of 2010. And once again, you see a struggle between the constitution and the reality. And I remember, because I was the secretary of the Kenya Constitution Review Commission, we invited Professor Ali Mazurui to deliver a paper, and this was the title of his paper. He says, if African politics is ethnic prone, can we have constitutions that are ethnic proof? It is a paper that I commend to you, because he looks at the constitutional order and he sees the gap between the prescriptions of the Constitution and what actually happens on the ground. Why is it that we make unto ourselves so many promises that we cannot deliver? But it is also important to note that because of that history, you have problems with this constitution. The third constitution that one wants to pay attention to is the Constitution of Tanganyika. It is important to note that before we had Tanzania, we had Tanganyika. And Tanganyika regains our independence in 1961-62, and at that time it is a constitution that is Westminster model. But no sooner, and you East Africans must always be reminded about this. In 1962, Julius Kambarage Nyerere actually agreed to postpone the independence of Tanzania so that Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania could be independent as one nation. He came here and talked to Kabaka, Mutesa then, and Apollo Milton Obote, and even to Benjamin Kiwanuka, and asked them, let us delay, I'm delaying our independence. He came to Kenya and talked to Jomo Kenyatta and said, I'm delaying my independence. And this is what Mwalimu said. He said, I'm prepared because you, Kenyatta, are older, you will become the president. And what I want is to be ambassador of East Africa to the United Nations. Many people do not know that reality because he was able to recognize very early that these post-colonial states which divided ethnicities arbitrarily were not sustainable. But be that as may, I'm talking about Tanganyika. So in Tanganyika, you also have the revolution in Zanzibar with Sheikh Amani Abeid Karume, and in 1964, there is the union between Tanganyika and Zanzibar to create Tanzania, which then leads to the death of number one, TANU, and leads to the death of Afro-Shirazi Party, and leads to the formation of Chama cha Mapinduzi in 1977. And you can see that Tanzania is also grappling. They are saying, we have this constitution, but where is constitutionalism? What is it that answers to our Tanzania-ness? And it is in that context that you must understand the Arusha Declaration of 1967, because it is a search for Tanzania-ness. It is a search for Tanzania-ness. Apollo Milton Obote, who is a protege of Nyerere, also takes that path and thinks that the common man's charter is a search for Ugandan-ness. Of course, that is not realized. In Kenya, we even found something that is called the Lumumba Institute, named for Patrice Emery Lumumba. But Kenya is schizophrenic. We are neither to the east nor to the west. We are confused. There are others who are pro-west and others who are pro-east, and ultimately we end up with session of paper number 10 of 1965 on what we call African socialism, but ultimately we are bought by the West, and we have remained so bought. And I'm mentioning this that you may understand before I'll come to the second tier of my intervention. That is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Then we come to Rwanda, Urundi. When we come to Rwanda, Urundi, these are, the conflict is manufactured. The Belgians have created an environment which is going to be a powder keg in both Rwanda and in Burundi in 1962. They have attacked the monarchy in Rwanda. They have created animosity between two peoples whom they call the Tutsi and the Hutu. The Batwa are too small demographically. And ultimately, you now have this conflict that you have the genocide in 1959 and ultimately the genocide in 1994 and the ongoing animus between Rwanda and Burundi. And of course, we know the Paul Kagame administration that is still in power. And RPF is also in the nature of a political movement which is a liberator. So that if you look at the intellectual inclination of the two leaders of Uganda and Rwanda, they are ideologically of the same persuasion. Ideologically, because they were liberators, and their thinking is that they are people who are indispensable, and they have no shortage of people who also tells them that you are Moses holding rod and staff in your hand, parting Red Seas. We want you to continue parting Red Seas. So they are caught up between the adoration by the people that they lead and the demands of these things you call constitutionalism. So when you talk to President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni or you talk to Paul Kagame and you tell them, let us have term limits, he says, but that is Western democracy. My people still think that I should serve them. Who are you? And that argument, there are those who think it is a legitimate question and is a legitimate issue. My friend Norbert, of course, did say, and those of you who are readers of Shakespeare will remember that there is a play by Shakespeare called Measure for Measure. It was written in the year 1623. And one of the quotations you get there is that if you have the power of a giant, it is excellent to have the power of a giant, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant. And there is also a saying, I think the Baganda also put it, I've repeated it times without number, that no matter how good a dancer you are, you must know when to leave the stage. This is, when we talk about term limits, this is what we are saying. And Nyerere put it so very well in 1985. He said, you are not successful until your successor succeeds. And I think there is merit in that. So when we talk about constitutionalism, we also must remind ourselves, even as I say what I'm saying, we must remind ourselves that there is also culture with which we are fighting. There is a cultural issues. If you are an Omugabe or a Kabaka, you don't cede power. It's God who denies you when he takes you upstairs. How do we deal with those realities? So when we talk about that, then you can see the difficulties with freedom fighters. Tanzania is a different kettle of fish. Those of you who had the advantage of working with Nyerere, I interned with him when he left power. And actually, before 1984, 9th day of December, when I first met him, he understood the dynamics of power. He understood the dynamics of and the frailty of the African nation, the post-colonial African nation. Tanzania has 136 ethnicities, governed differently before the colonialists came. Then you gridlock them into this thing called Tanzania. And he asks, what is Tanzania? Because the first point of identification is that I'm a Mhaya. I'm a Mnyamwezi. How do you reconcile your Nyamweziness with your Tanzanianness? When you come to Uganda, you are Baganda, you are Acholi. How do you reconcile your Bagandaness and Koleness, Acholiness with your Ugandanness? In the context of this broad brush constitution that talks about an independent judiciary, talks about a legislature, talks about the civil society, talks about the executive, and talks about human rights, which according to that constitution were conceived with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How do you deal with it? When you go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, there are 233 ethnicities and counting. So that when that country is regaining her independence in 1960 with Patrice Emery Lumumba, on day number 1, And I want you to listen to the speech of Lumumba on the day that they were being granted independence. Listen to the speech of Lumumba and the speech of Kasavubu on that day. These are two people going to lead a nation, and they are already thinking differently. And no wonder within 9 months, Lumumba had been assassinated, leading, of course, to Kasavubu and ultimately to the kakistocratic kleptocracy of Mobutu Sese Seko. Kakistocracy to mean a government by your very worst, and kleptocracy to mean a government of thieves. And Congo has never been at rest. So you can have the best constitution you have. But he's talking about Bakongo. He's talking about Bangala. He's talking about Batetela. How do you deal with that? That is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Then we come to Somalia, which is in trouble and where the Ugandan troops are. What is Somalia? Somalia that we know was actually, part of it was a colony of the Italians, which in itself was a sick man of Europe. And then there was a Somaliland, which was a colony of the United Kingdom. On the eve of independence, they are united. And that is why you now see what is happening. If you saw the original flag of Somalia, it has 5 stars to talk about the Somali nation. Somalis in Somalia, Somalis in Ogaden in Ethiopia, Somalis in Djibouti, Somalis in Somaliland. So there is what in law is called irredentism, the desire to claim lost territory, which still, and of course Somalis in Kenya. When you have a constitution that is irredentist in character, how do you have constitutionalism in that regard? So these are the issues that are on the table. And South Sudan. The history of South Sudan is known. And I always remind people to remember that when the Anglo-British group said that South Sudan would be a closed district, the north in Khartoum had been Islamized and Arabized. The south, they say, the English not us, they say, were animist and Christian. And of course, I want you to listen to these words in the year 2009 of John Garang de Mabior. Garang de Mabior goes to Khartoum and says, if you want us to remain as one nation, make unity attractive. Make unity. Garang did not want the split between Sudan and South Sudan. He wanted a united Sudan. But he said, make unity attractive. Ultimately, he dies. We have the administration that we have. But the administration is now a victim of ethnic nationalism. And what is ethnic nationalism flying in the face of a constitution? The constitutions are innocent. The constitutions are innocent. The nationalism, the Dinka or the Jiang are saying, we are the ones who fought for independence, therefore we must have the cake. The Nuer or the North are saying, we also participated in the struggle for independence, we must have the cake. The Shilluk or the Ocholo are also saying the same thing. The Equatorians are also saying the same thing. So you have a constitution which is only honored in breach. The razzmatazz that was there on the day of independence is immediately attacked by the trials of tribulations of a wedding where the two couples are sleeping on the same bed, but the wife has different dreams and the husband has different dreams. And that is why South Sudan ends up where she is now, the only country in the whole earth with 5 vice presidents. And why do you need? It may look stupid on the face of it, but he is addressing a reality on the ground. That one of our own is there. It is a feel-good effect. It doesn't give you matoke on the table, but it makes you feel good, one of our own. These are the realities that we confront in the continent of Africa. So, as I draw to the conclusion of my presentation, that gives you a scenario of what constitutionalism is about. But let us look at the attempts. I want to take you to 1963. In 1963, between the dates of 22nd of May and the 25th of May, there is a meeting of the 32 heads of states and government of the countries that had regained independence in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. 32 of them. Everybody who spoke recognized how weak the states are. I remember through history the speech of a leader whom many of us do not know, out of a country that we do not know, but as I speak is in turmoil, Central African Republic, David Dacko. David Dacko says, I'm happy to be here because the little country that I had called Central African Republic cannot succeed. I am for unity. Julius Kambarage Nyerere says, we have come here not to remind ourselves of the significance of unity. Unite we must. Ultimately, the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah speaks. And he says, if we are serious, then let us live here with one common currency. Let us live here with one army. Let us live here with one foreign policy. Let us live here having decided the capital of the new country called Africa. I do not know what others will say, but on my part, I propose Leopoldville in DRC, which is now Kinshasa. They listen to him not. And we are where we are, grappling with constitutionalism and the nexus between constitutions and constitutionalism. We in East Africa also recognize the significance of having unity as something that would immunize us from ethnicity. And we had the East African Federation from 1967 through to 1977. And many of you here will remember nostalgically General Mugisha Muntu, Miriam Matembe, my good friend, East African Airways. It worked. Today we have Ugandan loss-making, Tanzania loss-making, Kenya loss-making. East African harbors, telecommunication. We sat one examination. There were good days. Then we lost it all. Then in 1999, we came up with what is now East African Community 2. And we said in the new treaty that we'll have a customs union, a common market, common currency, and ultimately a political union. But the leaders were not satisfied. They were not satisfied. So that Benjamin William Mkapa, Mwai Kibaki, and Yoweri Kaguta Museveni himself agree in the year 2004 to appoint a committee for fast-tracking of political federation in order to ensure that we enjoy rights. The fast-tracking report is delivered to the heads of state, the summit, on the 30th day of November in Arusha, 2004, and these were the landmarks. In the year 2009, we would have a common currency. We should be having a common currency. In January 2010, the president of East African Federation would have been appointed. We don't have one 14 years later. And in 2017, we now downgraded it. It's no longer a federation, but a confederation. Ladies and gentlemen, I can talk until the cows come home, but there is no wisdom in so talking. Wisdom only demands that I remind us that the continent of Africa, having talked about Africa, is now in a space where people are grappling with the question of the nexus between constitutions and constitutionalism. We are grappling, as to use the Mao analogy, whether the promises made at the wedding will be fulfilled during the marriage. This is the question. This is the question. And it would appear that that is not happening almost everywhere in Africa. It would appear that the gap between the promise and the delivery, there is something, because I hear people grumbling in South Africa. I hear them grumbling. I hear them grumbling in Namibia. I hear them grumbling. I hear them fighting as I speak in Mozambique. There is an election and we can't even count votes. The Africans can't count votes. The Americans counted 18 million votes within 10 hours. In Kenya, it takes us 2 weeks. In Nigeria, even longer. In Uganda, I don't know how long it takes you, but even when they are counted, you don't agree. And if you look at Africa today, the issue of constitutionalism, this is what is bringing in war. The Ethiopians thought through Meles Zenawi in 1984 that they would immunize Ethiopia from this kind of constitutional turbulence by saying in the constitution that you could actually have secession. And what do we have now? We have had a war in Tigray. There is a threat of war in Oromo. There is an ongoing war in Amhara. And there is a possibility of another conflagration in the Ogaden. Even Ethiopia is suffering. We saw their conflict with Eritrea. South Sudan. Even only yesterday, President Salva Kiir has once again appointed a new team to go for the Tumaini conference in Nairobi. South Sudan itself, there is war. Chad in the Sahel. The organization, African Union, says there will be no unconstitutional changes of power under the Malabo Declaration. We have had unconstitutional change in Gabon, in Niger, in Burkina, in Guinea, and a near successful one in Guinea-Bissau. In other words, what we see as we interrogate these issues is this: how do we ensure that our governments respect constitutions? My view is this, as Fidel Castro once said: when you are pushing the door of revolution, never say die, because you never know when the door will open. In fact, when you are getting tired, that is when the door is about to open. And I believe that one of the things must happen is that we must increase the political maturity of the masses. It is Corazon Cojuangco Aquino in Philippines who said that if the masses do not understand what a constitution is, then what you call an election is nothing but a conspiracy of fools. In other words, it is incumbent upon us to make the masses awake. When the masses are awake, then they'll make demands, because it is still true, as Marx once said, that the safety of the bourgeois demands that the proletariat be kept in the most profound ignorance. And next to ignorance, the worst thing is the arrogance of power. And it can only be nipped through awareness. That is the lesson of history throughout the world. And I hope that in East Africa, we shall be moving through debate, because debate, which is debate that enriches, is the mother's milk of what we call democracy. Lastly, as I grow older, when people tell me democracy, I tell them, what does it mean? Because the Westerners appear to be telling us that democracy equals to multi-party, equals to periodic elections, equals to separation of powers notionally, executive, judiciary, and legislature, equal to having Bill of Rights, You can all have all these, but they are empty shells. In order to have the real thing, the real deal, the people must be aware. That is the lesson of history. And I hope that these engagements will give us the impetus to continue making demands, but speak with the firmness that opens the eyes of the leader, not with the arrogance and stupidity that inflames and justifies their anger. That is my message to all of us. It shall be well with us. And lastly, remember, this is an intergenerational struggle. So if you imagine that all the dividends of your battle will be won during your lifetime, you are deluding yourself. Run your race, run your leg, hand over the baton to one generation and the next generation, and lo and behold, when history is written, it shall be said, there lived a great generation who ran their race well. Thank you.
Indeed, indeed, a powerful, critical keynote deserving of a standing ovation. Another round, a powerful one, I beg you to give Professor Patrick Loch Otieno Lumumba. Thank you, Pastor Sempa. Thank you very much. Yeah, you could. No, we needed you here. Sorry for the confusion. So we have an important signing ritual that we would like you to perform. May I also invite Honorable Norbert Mao, please just come over here. Dr. Sarah Birete, please make it here as well. Honorable Winikiza, please join the team. And I have the markers actually here with me. Sorry, I just moved with them. So what we are actually doing, ladies and gentlemen, is the signing for the official launch of the Katiba Heritage Museum. Honorable, sorry. Who else? I wanted to give everyone their marker. Just let me just make way. Okay. Get to black or red? You want red?
From here, that's why I was showing you this.
Okay. Okay, General Muntu, please, we'd also like you to come and sign. Honorable Miriam Matembe, we could also like you to come and put your signature here on the board. Yes. Okay. Pastor Martin Sempa, please come and join. Mr. Godbert Tumushabe, you will also be making your way there. I'll invite, who is that gentleman? Eh? Please. Yes, when they're done signing. And then the rest. Honorable Ken Luchamuzi, could you please join us here and also put your signature on the board? Okay. We also would like to invite the EU, someone from the EU team. I don't know if the ambassador is still around. GIZ, our partner, please come over. Just send a representative to come and pen their signature here. Okay, stop at Henry. Okay. Henry Muguzi, please join us. Okay, all right. Honorable Leandro Komakech, please come and sign. And our chat show team, Major Awichpola, Dr. Roberto Jambo, Professor Ndebesa, Mr. Joseph Ocheno, please, you'll make your way here. Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought you. Okay, so as the signing is taking place, I would like at this juncture to let you know that we're moving to the next item. We're preparing for that, which is our panel discussion, our panel conversation. We have 4 panelists who will be addressing 4 key themes, but